Yeah, good morning, everybody. And thanks very much for attending. Much appreciated. Can you see the slides okay? Are they in full screen mode? Okay. Can
Yes, we
someone
can
just...
see.
Okay, great. Thank you. Right. So yeah, what I want to do today is just share with you the learnings that we have accrued, having run a series of dialogues and done a bunch of research. And Melissa's already beautifully described that process. But it's about sort of 6 months, 6 to 12 months of doing, custom research, having consultants support us on some of that research, doing some of it in-house, engaging with stakeholders through the energy dialogue process we ran. And this project originated out of the February 2022 commissioner strategy session, where commissioners decided that they would look into electricity or energy planning more broadly, but specifically electricity planning in the first half of this year, to support government processes like the IRP update, but also make a more general recommendation on electricity planning and climate change to the president and to cabinet. And so we will be focusing on electricity in the first half and then expand the scope to energy as a whole in the second half of the year. So this presentation is very much focused on electricity. We did share with you a longer slide deck as part of the sort of reading for the pack, and I'm going to run through a couple of highlight slides here and not necessarily cover everything. The first point is we need some sort of means of comparing different types of energy systems, and this has come up a lot, both from stakeholders and the research as a good framework for doing that. So it's the World Energy Council's energy trilemma, and it really looks at energy systems across these three things that need to be in balance: energy security, energy equity, and environmental sustainability. Energy equity refers to things like access, affordability, fair distribution of benefits and costs. Environmental sustainability, of course, refers to climate change, water, and health, predominantly through air quality, but also we should probably be thinking about a broader set of just transition issues in South Africa's context that include sort of employment and access opportunities. And then energy security is really how reliable is the system and how stable is the system. And there are a lot of reports for us to draw on, that all think about the energy trilemma as a means of analyzing energy systems. And I think that you'll probably agree that, at least in the South African context, pricing and access is best served by renewable systems. Renewable systems tend to be cheaper as of today in South Africa, but also have some advantages in terms of enhancing access because of things like microgrids and embedded generation and rooftop solar. On the sustainability side, it's clear that the big gains will be in the renewable system. And then, so the big debate in South Africa has really been focused on this idea of whether variable renewable energy systems are more secure or can be as secure as what is termed baseload systems. Anyway, there are lots of studies that we can draw on, and really they conclude more or less the same things, that these variable renewable energy systems are secure, particularly at the kinds of renewable energy penetrations we would be thinking about prior to 2030 and even into the sort of late 2030s. They all recommend, unconstrained by climate change. So just their least cost modeled descriptions are all based on scaling up renewables, building battery storage, and some support for peaking. Now, peaking is typically gas in these studies. So that's generally what the least cost scenario would look like. So it doesn't matter really which local international model you look at, they all do more or less the same things: massive urgent investment in renewables, urgent investment in the grid. In South Africa in particular, this is a big challenge. None of the models are selecting for coal or nuclear, although those technologies exist as options within the model. So the model are not choosing those for cost-based reasons. And there's this limited role for gas for peaking. Depending on the study, there's a range of sort of 5 to 15% utilization of gas installed capacity. Big investments in storage, The need to manage inertia and frequency is something that comes up as these systems start to select for renewables. So many of you will know the big challenge in a variable renewable system is the inertia and the frequency management in the system, which typically in older systems would have been supplied simultaneously by generation technologies like coal, but aren't necessarily provided with renewable energy technologies or variable renewable energy technologies. And so you need other solutions to help manage inertia and frequency. And so these are things like synchronous converters and grid forming inverters, synchronous condensers, and grid forming inverters. And so there are technologies that exist to help us manage that. And we're doing some more research in that particular space. The other neglected topic that I think that comes up is energy efficiency is critical. So in all of the models that we've seen, people assume high penetrations of energy efficiency practice and technology, and we don't necessarily see that in practice. So we think investment and sort of behavior change investment isn't at the scale that we need to meet those goals. Many of the energy efficiency targets in the models correspond with the National Energy Efficiency Strategy, which look at somewhere between 30 and 40% for most stakeholder groups and sectors. So it's kind of what a least cost solution would look like. So this is what the models are looking at, even if you unconstrain it by climate change. So cost changes really come depending on how you constrain the model. So if we think about carbon budgets, if you take a very strict carbon budget, then the model will build renewables and batteries far earlier than it does if you don't take in a climate constraint. And then that, of course, does push the price up relative to the least cost baseline. And then the other consequence of enhancing those budgets is you would then close coal earlier. So there are a couple of things that we should be careful about and watch when we're thinking about these models. There are a couple of technologies that are not yet mature enough to really form the basis of any kind of long or short-term energy planning. But if they were to be developed to a more mature level and a more cost-effective level, might be game changers. So we need to be kind of constantly watching. And I guess there's a warning in how we think about modeling. There is uncertainty, especially as you get into longer timelines. And so the two notable technologies that we've put on a watch list are SMR, small modular reactors, so small scale nuclear. And this is very early stage technology with only 1 or 2 plants commissioned around the world, nothing yet actually built. And so we watch that with interest. And then, of course, carbon capture and storage, sometimes carbon capture utilization and storage. Again, a technology that could be helpful, not necessarily in power, but more broadly in South Africa's industry structure. That's a technology to watch as well. So just to kind of summarize that, if we think about the two systems, a variable renewable energy system versus a more traditional energy system, the variable renewable energy system has advantages across all of the spectrums. I mean, a fair distribution of benefits and costs, I think, really comes down to the deep question of a just transition, which is core to how the PCC thinks about climate transitions in general. But both systems are deemed sort of by the studies we've seen and the experts and academics we've spoken to be equally reliable and stable. You just implement them in very different ways. But just to dwell on the just transition for a bit, the changes that will result from needing to alter our economy to be climate competitive will be significant. We will need to overhaul our economy in very fundamental ways. And so the opportunity for us is to think about how we overhaul that economy such that we also take the opportunity to fix things like structural unemployment, inequality, and poverty. And so the how is a big question and something that we need to spend a lot more time thinking about as broad stakeholder groups, but it is the sort of primary driver of how the PCC thinks about the world. So the long-term solutions are very much driven by this mix of renewables, storage, and peaking support, and then then the question, of course, is, well, we're in this big energy crisis now. And so what does that mean for how we implement? And in actual fact, the short-term energy solutions are also renewables-based. You see that same kind of profile when we're thinking about short-term options, so big investment, renewables, storage, and peaking support. And for a number of reasons. Cost is a primary driver, but also just time to install. The only real technologies that you can get on in the sort of 18 to 24 month timelines that we need are renewable-based systems. Renewable systems are also modular, and so you can take advantage of technology gains and innovations over time. And so we see the cost curves of renewables getting cheaper over time, whereas if you install big capacity, then you kind of lock that price in over a longer period. So one of the key challenges to any sort of short-term implementation is the constraints on the grid. So you would have read much about this, but South Africa's grid investment has been insufficient for a reasonable amount of time, and so there is only so much grid capacity available. And we often talk about how the best place for renewables, particularly for solar radiation, is in the Northern Cape. But in fact, you can't really extract any more power out of the Northern Cape because of transmission grid constraints. And it will take time to upgrade that infrastructure. So obviously an immediate priority is to begin the upgrading of that long-term grid, so that we don't run into a similar kind of problem that we have today in 10 years' time. But in the short term, that grid constraint then also forms the basis of the focus for any energy planning. And so one of the key recommendations that come out of our consultations is that we think about where grid capacity is available and focus our investment in those spaces. And that kind of spatial focus will need some governance reform. So we would need to change the way the REI-PPP process is structured, but we would also have to think about much more transparency on these grid access points, who owns rights to them, that kind of question. But the spatial approach gives us a number of advantages. We can be very specific about where the opportunities are, whereas rather the current bidding system works, you're looking for the best available sites. Here we'll be focused on very specific sites that have access to the grid and that can make an immediate difference. But we will also have a sense of how much resource will we need, what skills, where, what roads need to be upgraded, what kind of port infrastructure would be needed to access those sites. And so you can have a much more transparent plan around how we would develop renewable generation, which would then also give hope to people who need to understand what is happening, how long will it take, how long will load shedding carry on for. So we think that this is a basis of one of our recommendations, and there are a number of things that come with this kind of spatial thinking. The one thing that we would also do is, if you're developing renewable generation in an inverter, in an access point onto the grid, you would then also put batteries on that same side so that you kind of spread out the supply. So basically, if your grid is congested and renewables are able to produce more energy than the grid can take, you can kind of put that into the batteries and then release that when it's needed later on. You can do similar kinds of things on the demand side. So on the city side of the grid, you're able to put in battery storage that then allows the city to sort of spread out their demand. So there are a number of interesting things that come with this kind of spatial planning, but we think the big advantage is it focuses on grid access, which is really where we need to focus right now. And it also provides a very transparent way of being able to report progress. So just jumping onto the key points around just transition, there are a whole range of things that need to be done, and our next slide also talks about technical recommendations. And when the PCC makes recommendations, we'll focus on a few priority areas that we think are strategic and can make a big system impact. But it doesn't mean that any of these other issues are less important. And you know, as a system, we need to be focusing on all of these things, and it's certainly something that the PCC is thinking about. And yeah, to make the point, there are a bunch of technical recommendations that are out there. The sort of energy action plan released by government and the reporting on that, those are all important things that all require support, and sort of broadly fitting into categories such as improving the EAF as much as possible. Clearly, that's very important. Continue to work on the just transition. That's really important. There's getting as much generation on the grid as possible, and the role of the private sector and rooftop solar and all of the exciting reforms that were announced in the budget speech. These are all very important things. The things, though, that we've settled on and we offer for discussion as priority investment areas or priority focus areas are these, and there's no particular order to them here. It's just a long list. We're happy to get your thoughts on which of these are higher priority for you, and if there's any that you think we've particularly missed. So the first really is thinking about short-term spatial plans that maximize grid usage. This is the point that I spoke about, and this allows some transparency in reporting. There's some large-scale governance reforms that are required to support the short and the long-term electricity system, particularly thinking about an independent grid operator responsible for energy planning. That's a key thing that we think needs to be accelerated. We know that this is in progress, but let's get this done. Making queuing systems for grid access transparent. I've mentioned that already. Adjusting the pricing system to be cost reflective and unbundled. So we think we need a lot more transparency on pricing, and that pricing needs to adequately cover the costs of producing that electricity. The unbundled portion is having clear prices. They wouldn't necessarily be levied separately to consumers, but that you have a price for what it costs to generate electricity and what it costs to get that electricity through the transmission and distribution grid to consumers. And this will enable a much more distributed grid type system, as well as more markets and services. Part of those market services would be sort of a day-ahead market that allow generators to bid into an independent grid operator. The third area is a huge drive on energy efficiency. So we mentioned that energy efficiency is sort of neglected, and with that, storage and demand side management. Investing in grid upgrades to support the continuing addition of renewable generation is really important, both in the long term and in the short term. So there are opportunities for Eskom to invest in the grid in the short term that will enable more access in particular sites. And then on the just transition side, sort of three things have emerged out of our consultations that we think are important. The first is providing support for public, private, and household renewable energy generation. And we saw a lot of that in the budget speech, which is exciting, but it will still require some policy reform and support. Secondly, ensuring measures are in place to support those who are most impacted by load shedding. So unfortunately, load shedding is likely to be with us for at least another 18 months and probably longer. And so how do we support those that are impacted, particularly at an SMME level from load shedding? And so this includes people who operate small equipment like electricity clippers at a barber shop or refrigeration and spaza shops that really have quite important impacts on the community. And then this sort of would also include thinking about free basic electricity and providing access to communities that can't necessarily afford electricity, and making sure that the existing free basic electricity disbursement actually reaches communities. At the moment, it's estimated that not all of that is happening, and then also start to consider what an improved free basic electricity allocation might look like. And then finally, the big challenges, of course, in employment, and that can have some very localized impacts. So as we phase out coal, for example, the majority of impacts are in Mpumalanga, as you know. And so what kinds of job creation support would we have in those regions, and providing a one-for-one job swap of jobs lost from coal and transition to renewable energy is only the first step. If we manage to achieve that, we would still have 40% unemployment and 65% youth unemployment in a place like Mpumalanga. So there needs to be a really big focus on what else do you stimulate in these regions that help to create jobs and create growth. So these are the high-level recommendations and high-level summary of the sort of process and thinking that we've gone through. I'd love to hear your comments and questions. And obviously, you'll have a second opportunity to comment in the next consultation. So this is really just to give you a introduction into what we're thinking, so that you have time to think about it and respond again in the second session. But of course, we're happy to take initial reflections now. So I will hand back to the facilitators and yeah, happy to take questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Steve Nichols is the head of education at the Climate Commission, and thanks for laying out the recommendations and also giving a background to the recommendations. I'm now going to request that we follow as Melissa has laid out at the beginning. Just we have a kind of clarity seeking or some comments, but however, I would want us to just have clarity seeking questions and also comments, brief comments, straight to the point and not take too long, so that we can have a chance to have the second presentation, but also that we still have a bigger chance on the 27th of March for the hybrid session, so that we can be able to bring more comments. And I know other people have already started developing the written comments. And so I would want us to just be brief to the point. We've got 30 minutes on this discussion, or we can decide that we have two presentations and have a much more time to engage in both presentations. But I see Jesri Klinsky has a hand up already, and I will give you the floor to make your clarity-seeking question or your comment. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very well.
So I'm Jesri Klinsky. I'm a junior researcher at the Institute for Economic Justice. So I just wanted to ask about the presentation. Is a move towards cost-reflective pricing not likely to kind of severely worsen energy poverty? It really seems to be something that very few countries have achieved internationally, even though many of them have attempted to push in that direction for decades. And given the developmental mandate of actually achieving energy affordability for the majority of the South African population, it seems like it really has the risk of drastically worsening energy poverty, especially because free basic electricity is not enough electricity for households to meet even basic needs, let alone any income generating activity. Thank you. That was my question.
Makoma, I think you're still on mute.
Thank you very much, Jesri, for that question, comment. And on the chat, Q&A, we also have two interventions from Richard Worthington, who's asking, is there still a prospect of thematic workshop engagements, such as on addressing energy poverty within this current process? Or have this fallen away with the expansion of more general consultations with stakeholder groups? And the second comment or question is from Katrina Lechman-Krube, whose comment says, it seems from the recommendations on the support for an independent grid operator that the PCC is supportive of the unbundling of Eskom. Is this correct? So these are the two comments, and I think, Steve, you have noted, but I will also request Kunge and Jobe to take the floor. Thanks. You're welcome, Kungeka.
Sorry, my apologies. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very well.
Can you hear me? Hi. We just wanted to make, I'm from WWF South Africa. I'm head of program. We thank you very much to the commissioners and to Steve, who just presented. We are still considering what was put forward to us, so we don't have a formal response as WWF yet. But there are things that already strike us, or rather would perhaps want to put on the table as a concern. One is the fact that I think this short-term electricity crisis is almost triggering what a risk of policy incoherence and confusion, which will happen shortly, because we indeed, the IRP as it stands now needed to be amended to align with the NDC targets that were recently revised. At the same time, we have a gap here in terms of the integrated energy plan, which is not in place yet and adopted. And so the short term, and then we've got the short-term electricity crisis plan. So the question is, to what extent is the PCC ensuring that there is coherence and limit confusion in terms of policy, and that all these policy interventions are talking to each other? In fact, I would even go further and ask, do we really need a standalone IRP now that we've got a short-term electricity crisis plan, or rather we should be putting a lot of effort into the integrated energy plan, which would cover everything, but also an integrated energy plan considers the fact that there's a huge amount of transformation, significant transformation in terms of the role of electricity, not just for, as we currently use it, but also for mobility purposes. So I think we need to be thinking comprehensively and more strategically that way. So the question is, how do we ensure that there isn't confusion, and also there's coherence in policy, particularly because we run a risk of also leaving a lot of people out of participation in this new emerging energy system. But also, we also need a better coherence. So we just wanted to put that on the table. I think the recommendations that are being made, they come from a basis which we will totally support. They're based on studies. We would agree with many of those, but of course we will make comprehensive comments on the 27th when we reconvene again. Thank you. Yeah. Can she?
Makoma, do you want me to step in?
And yes, I would like you to respond to those 4 questions and comments, the 2 from on the chat, and also the 2 that we got. Kungeka, to lower down your hand.
Okay.
Sorry about that, Steve. Please go ahead.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you. Yeah, some very good questions. So maybe starting off with Jezre's question. So that's that your point is exactly why we simultaneously have suggestions around making pricing more cost reflective, but at the same time making sure that there is a working free basic electricity allowance, and that free basic electricity allowance is raised to consider the points you made around what you need just to have a functioning household, but then also to generate SME type income. So that's really important. I mean, the cost reflective part we think is important because it pushes the cost onto the energy user. I mean, that cost ultimately has to be paid. So it's either coming out of the sort of tax revenue or it's coming out of users. And so a more cost reflective tariff puts the pressure on the users. And we think that will have a stimulating effect on energy efficiency, but we recognize the concern that you raise as an important one, is that does put some additional pressure on the poorer consumer who already can't afford electricity. So those two things do have to come in parallel, and happy to hear some more thoughts from you around that. To Richard's question on the thematic workshop on energy poverty, yes, very much so. So this is something that we committed to do last year, is to have a dedicated session on energy poverty as an event. So for those of you who aren't familiar, we ran 7 events last year looking at various aspects of energy transitions, stability of the grid, finance, just transition and jobs. And one of the points that was raised by civil society in general was that we need a bigger deep dive on energy poverty. And so that is something that we are still planning on doing. The reason we haven't scheduled it yet, Richard, is just congestion in diaries. But it is an important issue for us. Katrina, on unbundling of Eskom, yes, we effectively support that, and we don't yet have a recommendation on it because we're still consulting, and so the details of that, there could be many different ways to do it, but this establishment of an independent grid operator we think is critical to the functioning of a modern electricity system. Kungeka, your points all useful. We do think the integrated energy plan is a very important document and is something that we would focus our attention on in the second half of the year. We do think, agree with your observation that this is a sort of overarching energy document that would help define some of the parameters of electricity planning. And so the cart is slightly the cart slightly before the horse here, but of course there's the ongoing IRP review that the DMRE are doing. So we want to be in a position to provide them with some clear guidance from a climate perspective. So that's kind of why we're driving the focus on electricity first, but we'll be focusing on the integrated energy plan and supporting that kind of review process once we've completed this initial sort of 3 to 4 months. And then generally your thoughts on policy coherence. This, the PCC are an advisory body, so we don't have any implementation function, but this is something that we have been considering in terms of, where do we need policy alignment, particularly when we start to get to the sort of economic diversification side. So the policy alignment's not limited to energy policy, but also to sort of economic development policy in general. And part of that, as many of you know, is the Just Transition Framework. So the PCC has developed this Just Transition Framework, which has been adopted by the President and Cabinet. And so we need to start seeing those Just Transition principles dripping down into key government processes like the setting of the budget, like the medium-term strategic framework, and sort of regional and provincial and local development plans. So we are focused on that, both from a sort of implementation support perspective and also from a monitoring and evaluation perspective. There were 2 questions that I picked up in the chat. McCormack, should I quickly address those as well? So yeah, Richard and Hilton both ask about the 4 research papers. So those were initially actually intended as sort of informing the internal research process, and we weren't necessarily going to publish them, but we're in the process of final reviews, and actually they're quite useful assessments of the status quo. So we'll probably put those out on our website in sort of 2 to 3 weeks time. And the sort of 4 research areas were the role of air quality minimum emission standards in energy planning, the sort of review status quo of energy regulation, at least at a national level, were 2. Then we did a review of the 3 main models that we've observed looking at energy, the work done by CSIR, the work done by the NBI, and the work done by UCT. So just looking at what were their input assumptions, how do they deal with different things, what are the pros and cons of the specific models. And then the 4th area that is an ongoing piece of work is looking at what a sort of early coal closure schedule might look like, and the different carbon budgets, and what are the sort of pros and cons from an economic, climate change, air quality perspective for each of those scenarios. So that piece of work is ongoing. It informs how we think about electricity planning, but it probably will only be complete sort of mid-year. So those are the 4 research areas that we've been looking at. And then the final question was from David Hallows that I've picked up. There may have been more since, asking about whether the PCC is looking at ownership. And this is a very important area of a just transition. So one of the bigger drivers of inequality is access to capital, and the rate at which capital grows relative to labor salary growth. And so people who have the capital basically get richer quicker, and that tends to enhance the inequality gap. So ownership is really important. We're looking at that very carefully, and we think that coming up with new or innovative ownership models, particularly on the electricity generation side, is a very important part of this problem. We're very happy for you to share with us research that any of you may have done in this space. We don't pretend to have any answers yet, but we are sort of starting to talk to a few of the civil society and labor stakeholders around some pilot studies in alternative ownership models. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve Nichols. And there was also a comment on the chat, somebody wanting to know of the consultations in Mpumalanga, and I think that would be to the Secretariat, particularly Blessing and Tabiseng, maybe to either respond on the chat or also come in at some stage to respond to that. I'm not sure if there's still other hands. If none, I would suggest that we get to the next session of the presentation, and then as people are taking notes, we can still come back to the discussions, because we'll have much more time after the presentation from the Presidential Climate Finance Task Team. So I would invite the Presidential Climate Finance Task Team, I'm not sure who's starting, to take the floor. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thanks, Makoma. I think we're going to go straight into the presentation, if that's okay to you. I'll do the introduction and talk a little bit about who's who in this zoo. So could we get the presentation?
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you very much to the PCC and its commissioners for running these sessions. So my name is Joanne Yarwich, and during the course of last year, I headed up the secretariat that ran the process of doing the technical work that went into the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan. And as there has been reference made in the conversation so far, that investment plan, so the Secretariat reported to both the Presidential Climate Finance Task Team that was run by Daniel Minele, who has subsequently stepped down and recently taken on the job of chairing the Nedbank board. And then on the other hand, we reported to the International Partners Group. I'll talk at the end, and I think there are a number of questions on the chat around the way forward in terms of both institutional arrangements and in terms of implementation modalities. So if you will bear with me, let me get through the presentation around what is in the investment plan itself. And then at the end, I'll spend some time trying to answer those questions to the best of my ability. And really, I think those are critical issues. So let's go on to the first slide. And before I go into the investment plan, just let me give you a reader's guide to the investment plan itself. I'm sure that a lot of you on this call are planning to put in written comment on the plan, as well as participate in the session towards the end of March. And so just for information, the investment plan, firstly, is available on the presidency website. Secondly, there has been circulation of documents for this session. The investment plan itself is divided into 3 sections. And the first is really a 12-page executive summary of the plan that summarizes the core proposals and the core issues in the plan. The second 100-page of the plan is really the investment plan itself and the proposals that have been made around both how this 8.5 billion offer from the International Partners Group should be deployed, as well as how the broader set of requirements of South Africa can be met, and how the finance that we need to raise should be deployed. And then the third 100 pages are really a set of annexures that set out the underpinnings and the assumptions and the methodologies and the data sources that were used to inform the plan. So I thought it would be useful to just outline that, so that in working your way through what is quite a thick document, you can more easily navigate it. Okay, so what I'm going to do is to take a very quick walk through what is in the plan, with quite a strong focus on the issues around the finance. And in doing that, I also will start off by talking about some of the parameters that informed the development of the plan. So the first slide, please. Okay, so I think that the plan's timeframe first, 2023 to 2027, that is because this plan is written in relation to the agreement, to the high-level political declaration that was made between South Africa and the International Partners Group at COP26 in Glasgow. And what that agreement talks about is a 3 to 5 year rolling program of cooperation between South Africa and the International Partners Group, with the $8.5 billion offer that was put on the table by the International Partners Group as the offer for the first 5 years of that rolling plan. And so when we started to say, how do we do this investment plan, what we felt would be useful would be to really focus on what does the country need in the first 5 year period. So I thought it would be useful for this audience to really explain that. Secondly, I think that what we did was to take, and what is set out in the slide is really, I suppose, both the institutional and the policy framework around climate change in the country, and our broad understanding of the issues of climate risk, the need, our commitment to move from a high carbon to a net zero economy, the need for an energy transition that is really well researched, well managed, and that will also address our socioeconomic challenges as a country, the need to have a whole of society transition, the establishment of the PCC, and then a set of issues around the NDC. And the NDC really is the fundamental framing, and I'll explain it a bit later when we get into the plan itself. That is I suppose, the boundary condition for that plan, is to say what kinds of resources would South Africa need in order to move from the top range of the NDC to the bottom range. Yeah, so I think that those are some of, I suppose, the framing issues. Let's move on. Okay, this kind of, in summary, looks at how the investment plan could support the pathway to a low carbon and climate resilient society. It looks at how we decarbonize the economy within that NDC target range. Bear in mind that I think in putting forward our ambitious NDC, we always understood as a country that we could get to the top end of that range by ourselves, probably with the right policies and the right financing and incentives, but that to get to that 350, to get to the bottom end of that NDC range is a significant ask and really requires support, financial and other support from the international community in accordance with, in particular, with the commitments that the developed world has made in the context of the UNFCCC. So when we looked at if we were to have the resources to do everything that we needed to do in order to get to the bottom end of that range to put ourselves on a path to meeting the bottom end of that range by 2030, what would need to happen in the next 5 years? What resources would we need? Our assessment is around 1.5 trillion rand. That would have to come from a wide range of sources. The political declaration talks about 3 priority sectors. With it focuses and limits this plan to 3 sectors. We are clearly understanding that there's a much wider set of sectors, as well as the issues around adaptation and resilience that in the long run, not in the long run, that our country needs to address. But this particular investment plan deals with electricity, new energy and electric vehicles and green hydrogen. And then in the process of doing the plan, what we identified is that to be able to implement the plan, the issues of human capital development and a skills plan and the issues around municipal distribution are key factors, key enabling factors, without which you aren't going to be able to achieve what the plan sets out to do. And so those were added. Next slide. Okay, I think that for those of you who've been following the Just Transition framework, what we took as, I suppose, our baseline was firstly the targets and the aspirations of the National Development Plan and what is set out in the Just Transition framework. And in particular, to protect workers and community, to build energy security in a way that expands energy access, to promote industrial development, drive innovation, develop sustainable livelihoods, enable economic diversification, and spur inclusive economic growth. And clearly that is a big ask to be able to achieve all of those multiple aims. But I think that that is fundamental to the way that that a just energy transition has to happen in our country, and I suppose sets out a set almost of indicators as to whether or not the transition is a just one and is one that can support a really fundamental change in the way that the economy and society work. Next slide. Okay, I'm now going to go into the slides that deal with the financing issues, and this slide sets out that 1.5 trillion rand that I spoke about, and essentially this is the division. So if we were to be able to have all of the finance on the table that we would need, we're looking at the bulk of it at this point in the plan goes into the electricity sector, 128 billion into the NEV sector, 319 to green hydrogen and to the creation of a new sector and the infrastructure required to support it, 2.7 billion for skills development. And I think important to say that that does not take into account the existing investment in the skills sector through the budget of the Department of Higher Education and Training, or the skills levies, or the SETAs, or anything else. And then 319 billion really into municipal capacity, and I'll talk a bit about that further on. Okay, so we see this as putting out what South Africa's ask is to both international and local investors. And really it's an ask that says South Africa wants to embark on a just energy transition. We want you to partner with us in a wide range of ways. Next slide. Okay. Another important boundary condition, and this slide sets it out. I'm not going to go into the detail of it, but the approach that we took as the Secretariat and that the PCFTT accepted was really that we took the existing policy framework at the time of writing as the baseline for the investment plan. And as you all know, this is a hugely rapidly changing policy environment. A whole lot has changed already since the investment plan was written in November in the way that the electricity sector operates, developments in the electricity sector. But we really took the framework is, and I think that Kungeka has raised some of the challenges around that framework. But I think in particular, we took the IRP as read. We took the DTIC's roadmap around NEVs, the work that the hydrogen economy roadmap that the Department of Science and Innovation has been working on. We took all of those as read and then proceeded to develop a plan in relation to that. And I think that going forward, as more and more reforms start to happen in the sector, and it looks as though they're going to move quite fast, we're obviously going to need to take account of them. Next slide. Okay, going into the detail of the plan, and I'm not going to go through all of these figures in great detail, but this sets out the infrastructure investment needs that we identified for the electricity sector. I said in the beginning that we are looking at a wide range of sources of finance, and when we look at where this finance is going to go, I think similarly, some of it is a large part of it is public sector. Some of it is also private sector investment, and it is, I think, investments that also go in part in the sector to Eskom, but also to other spheres of government, and particularly to municipalities. Next slide. Okay. What we try to do, and I think I'm very keen to hear the comments from this this constituency in particular on this, was to really try and say, over the next 5 years, what should we be doing in order to kind of basically make sure that the just transition starts to happen. And we identified a set of areas that need, in our view, resourcing. I think that people may agree or disagree with the amounts, but I think that more important than the amounts is really, or as important as the amounts are the categories. And I think that in particular, we're keen to know whether there are critical issues that have been left out. So the one part of it is really around what happens to existing coal plants and coal mining land, rehabilitation of land where coal mines are closed down. We felt that certainly in the Mpumalanga context, there's a really significant need to invest in infrastructure. In particular, I'm sure that all of you will know about the damage that, for example, the extent of coal trucking has caused to the road network in many parts of the province, and you're going to need to sort that out if you want to build a new economy. We put in an allocation to be able to support diversification initiatives. We identified the issue of what happens to coal workers in the coal value chain who are not going to find it easy to find new opportunities and new jobs and need a degree of social support. We put in an allocation around that. the issues of investing in youth and the skills issues are critical in relation to addressing our socioeconomic challenges, and that needs investment. Obviously, the need to plan and coordinate is a critical issue in Mpumalanga, and I think kind of there are questions already being asked around the consultation, but I think there are big questions also around coordination and planning, as well as looking at post-mining redevelopment. It links to both planning and to economic diversification, and then there is an allocation for capacity building. And I would see that all of this gets complemented and supported by existing programs, existing financial allocations from the fiscus and elsewhere, including, I would hope, from the private sector. Next slide. Yeah, okay, this is the last part of it. This is really allocations for localizing and rebuilding a manufacturing industry in relation to a new energy economy. And there, I think that it's one of the issues that has come up in the chat a number of times is really, we put in an allocation to be able to begin to start this work of piloting social ownership models, I think with the hope that if we can find viable models, that can then be rolled out at scale, and that part of the work of mobilizing finance into the future would be to be able to look at how we would be able to do that, to build financing models around social ownership that are viable and have the desired outcomes. Next slide. Okay. I said to you that we started doing the municipal work at quite a late stage in this process. We worked with quite a wide range of organizations working in the municipal energy space. And out of that came out with this allocation and these structures, just to say that further work needs to be done here. That first very large amount of 200 billion around infrastructure maintenance of the distribution infrastructure, which is obviously a huge problem at the moment across the country, does need to be disaggregated. It's an estimate. And so one of the things that needs to be done going forward in the implementation phase is to be able to do quite a lot more detailed work on this. But I think that Steve spoke earlier about what a modern grid requires. And unless we get our municipal distribution grid made fit for purpose, we aren't going to get very far in that. Next slide. All right. On the NEV sector, there is an amount of 128.1 billion. Again, this needs further work. We haven't done work at this point in time around some of the just transition implications of transition to both the production of electric vehicles for export, as well as for the development of an electric vehicle industry in South Africa. In the consultation that we did, I think the issue of how we can utilize the rollout of electric vehicles to improve the public transport system was identified as a critical issue, so that you don't just end up with an EV sector in South Africa that is for the rich. And so there is a big opportunity there. And in fact, many of the entrepreneurial initiatives that are already happening are focused, and private sector initiatives are focused on 2- and 3-wheelers and buses, and the opportunity in the public transport sector. That's why that is in there. Obviously, transport is our second largest emitting sector, so emissions abatement is important. We need to support innovation. There's a need for technical assistance. And then there's a question of how you support the industry and that entire value chain to be able to transition, and that global big amount at the bottom is intended to support that. This, again, this piece of work, this is a fast-moving conversation in the country. NAMSA, you will, I'm sure, have seen recently put out a document in relation to this. There needs to be work done with the DTIC to take it forward. Okay, let's move on to hydrogen. Okay. So there has been a lot of work done in South Africa over the last few years around green hydrogen. I think from two perspectives. The first is really around the question of whether we want to keep a heavy industrial sector going in South Africa, and if we do we want to carry on producing cement and steel? And if we do, how are we going to power it in ways that that move us towards net zero? And hydrogen is a critical part of that, is seen as a solution worldwide in relation to that. And there has been, as I said, a lot of work done within government and with the private sector around the potential of a green hydrogen economy. So we took that work as read and then came up with three areas of investment. The first is really around feasibility costs, and some of that work is already happening. There is a partnership, for example, between KfW and the IDC that has meant that some of these projects have been able to, the feasibility work has been able to be started for these projects. There's then significant capital costs in order to be able to start to build these sectors, as well as the need for infrastructure and potentially port infrastructure, which is put in at the bottom. And that is really because to be able to keep a local hydrogen industry going, we are also going to need to become an exporter. That is how the economics of the sector work. So that explains those allocations and those asks, I suppose. Next slide. Okay, skills. We have been, the Secretariat and the PCFTT have been roundly criticized by all stakeholders on this, as saying that allocation is far from adequate. And again, further work needs to be done. And I think importantly, we also need to look at what the existing skills ecosystem in relation to these particular geographies and areas are contributing, and then we need to come up with, I think, a robust skills plan. So again, this is an area where I think we agree that further work is needed. Next slide. Okay, so South Africa set out a set of principles around financing the JET IP that really depart from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the need for finance to be additional to existing climate and development commitments, the need for the financial instruments to reflect our unique needs as a country, the need to mainstream transition components, the need where there are loans for sovereign debt terms to be more attractive than could be secured in the capital markets, the need for certainty and predictability in financial flows, the need for the best institutions to manage finance, to have the finance channeled through them, appropriate risk sharing between when there are partnerships with the private sector, as well as the issues of governance and safeguards needing to be in place. And I think it's going to be very important that these principles and any adjustment or addition or amendment to them that comes out of the consultation really find their way into the way that we measure this program. Next slide. Okay, getting on to the 8.5 billion. Now, I kind of explained at the beginning that we took the attitude that the $8.5 billion is, I suppose, an input into a much larger ask for the 2023 to 27 period in South Africa. But this slide sets out how the $8.5 billion that is on the table is intended to be allocated, and sets out the division between grants. And I think there's been a lot from the president down. I think everyone, all South African stakeholders have said that the grant amount is distressingly low. The balance between that, grants, concessional loans, commercial loans, and guarantees, and this sets out the contribution of the different countries. I think important to say, and there are three areas that I want to explain about this, and then I'm going to race through the rest of the slides. The first is that the only funds that have flowed so far are in the form of two policy loans that have channeled to National Treasury and through the Fiscus, from France through their development agency AFW and the German development agency KfW and Treasury. They loans of 300 million euros each, and that has been signed off with a national Treasury. The other area right at the top is the Climate Investment Fund allocation to South Africa of 2.5 billion in concessional loans was approved in principle at the Climate Investment Fund board in October last year, and work is now being done to program that and to look at how that process would work and how those funds would be mobilized. There is still the US money is being channeled through the DFC, which is a private sector institution and funds both loans and equity to the private sector, and then the UK contribution, their guarantee is going to be channeled through the African Development Bank, and there's work ongoing between the African Development Bank and the UK government and South Africa to look at how that money is going to be leveraged and managed and programmed. So we are at a reasonably early stage in this process around the loan component of this. In relation to the grants and kind of venturing into implementation, we're currently in a process with the IPG partners for all of them to put on the table the detail of how they see this grant finance being allocated. Maybe to say that these figures are also shifting slightly. For example, both the US and the German government have committed additional grant finance over since the investment plan was done. And in this process that we are starting to do at the moment, to understand that additional finance would need to be figured into that. So we can come back to the $8.5 billion, but I thought it would be useful to just go into a little bit of detail on it. Next slide. Okay, implementation. Again, there are a set of features of the implementation that are set out in the investment plan. I'm not going to go into this in terribly much detail. We can talk about it going forward. I think it really, it's a program that has ministerial oversight. It looks at national government coordination, but looks at how we can coordinate and ensure that there is implementation at the appropriate level and by the appropriate agencies. National Treasury will be a key institution in terms of the sovereign loan agreements and the way that the finance is deployed and the conditions and management of that. We're looking at our national intermediary institutions and the support and role that they could play. We're looking at how community level governance and trade union structures can play an important role in the process, in particular around needs identification, involvement in the M&E processes, and then looking at how also the private sector investors who benefit from this program will report and how we can bring transparency to that as well. So I think those are some of the key features of implementation. I'll talk about institutions at the end. Let's go on. Okay, there are a couple of slides. Yeah. So in summary, we're looking at strong governance, robust management arrangements, really building a strong M&E and learning framework, and trying to identify risks at an early stage. Next slide. That's it. Thank you very much. Let me just say a few things about implementation. So the PCFTT produced this plan and handed it to the president. It was endorsed by cabinet. It's come back to all of you for consultation. In the meantime, what has happened is that a decision has been taken that the PCFTT infrastructure, together with that of the Secretariat, should be brought together, and that into an implementation, a project management unit that for the moment will report into the project management office in the presidency, and that it is at this point in time, we are busy going back over the investment plan, working with the IPG partners around the finance, and starting to identify what are the further pieces of work that need to be done, including, importantly, issues. I've spoken about some of the gaps and areas where we already think that there is either not enough information or where further work needs to be done. We are looking at what else is happening in the sector. So, for example, the issue of coordination in Mpumalanga was brought up. Primarily, the role of this implementation, this project management unit, will be to be able to look at how the $8.5 billion is deployed in a way that is consistent with the country's intentions, but also look at this broader financing architecture and look at how we can mobilize the additional finance that is needed in order to be able to make sure that this program has traction. So early stages, but that is at the moment at least an institutional arrangement that I think will remain in place for a year or two, during which I think there would need to be a conversation about, in the long run, how is this going to be managed? And as you know, there are all kinds of developments within government that this would need to align with. So I hope that that clarifies where we are at the moment, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Joanne. I'm very happy that the background of information that you had shared with us, I think this is some of the questions that in the civil society sector, people have been asking questions regarding that, the background of where the JETP comes from and what are the processes. I think that was very informative for us as a sector. I've noted and also questions on the chat, but what I'm going to do, I'm just going to do a mixture now. I'm going to request those who have posed questions on the chat and also takes hands. I have noted hands of Lebohang Lita. I have noted Jesri Krinsky. I have noted Nkosinati and Clement Mepudi. But before we go to the hands, I would like to invite those that have put questions on the chat. We had 3 people that were asking questions regarding the hydrogen, the green hydrogen. And we also had someone asking about whether these inputs from civil society, when they are being submitted, are they going to be incorporated, and how are they going to be weighted on the formal process? But I would like to request Lien from Sami, just to pose a question before we go to the other participants. That's okay with you?
Thanks so much, Makoma. Sorry for the background noise here. So yeah, thanks, Joanne, for that presentation. My question was, while green hydrogen for industrial processes is really sensible, those should ideally be financed by industry, those industries that would need to kind of reform their processes. We're also noting the inclusion of green hydrogen in the JET IP, as well as the green hydrogen commercialization plans and all of the kind of details that goes into. We would need massive investment in renewable energy for green hydrogen for export. However, that same renewable energy is urgently required for decarbonizing the electricity sector. In addition, we lack green hydrogen infrastructure. So given that South Africa is therefore unlikely to be a first mover in the green hydrogen export market, should the JET IP allocations to green hydrogen be removed and reallocated to social protection measures or other more urgent, less speculative priorities? Thank you, Makoma.
Thank you very much, Lien. Lindin Zwana, you had just a direct question. I would request that maybe you do that. Are you still on the line? Lindy? If not, may I request Ntabi Mutlakwana? She had questions around the free basic allocation of electricity and free basic electricity. If you could go ahead whilst we're still struggling to connect with Lindy Zwana.
Hi, Makoma. Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very well.
Okay. Let me just find my question. I forgot it. My question, and thank you, Joanne, for the presentation. My question was on municipal investment need. I didn't see the investment on FBE, that is free basic electricity and free basic alternative energy subsidies. So I didn't see the implementation of these, so I think it's missing. Why I'm raising this is because this is one of the important things needed to strengthen local municipality capacity in resolving the complexities they face in energy poverty alleviation. I think this should be considered and needs to be included in the JRC. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ntabi. May I request Deepak maybe to respond to the question around the inputs, whether they'll be incorporated and how would they be weighted for them to be incorporated, Deepak?
Thank you very much, Makoma. Am I visible and audible?
You are audible.
Yeah, thank you. I have put my video on, but the president, when he unveiled or presented the JET IP to a special sitting of the PCC in November last year, also indicated that this is a multi-year project that we're undertaking and that we need to both socialize it and get feedback from various constituencies, stakeholders, as well as communities. And it's on the basis of that mandate that we're conducting the current round of consultations. We were also then asked by the president to submit a PCC recommendation or response to the JET IP, which we are also going to process as the PCC, taking full account of the feedback and comments that we encounter in these consultations. The two reports are intended to be completed by the end of March. The first one being through a thorough and reasonably rational process enunciation of all the issues, recommendations, alternative suggestions, as well as disagreements that come out of these consultations, clustered and packaged per stakeholder group, and then pulled together into a coherent set of responses that we will present to the president from the PCC as the outcome of these consultations. These consultations, as I indicated, will also then go into a PCC process to consider what the PCC's own response and recommendations to the JET IP would be. And as a package of two reports, this is intended to be presented to the president by the end of March, but certainly by early April. Thank you.
Thank you, Deepak. I will now request Lebohang Lita, who had raised their hand. And before that, questions or clarity-seeking questions back to the recording on Facebook or on send in an email to mitigation@climatecommission.org. Simpiwe, please put the email address on the chat box, and what with the responses that to the emails, it would be like all the questions that may be received would be trapped together and be sent in like maybe after a week or so, because people can't just we can't respond to individual emails, but we'll try to trap them together, and so that responses can be fed back. So Lebohang Lita, you had your hand up.
Thank you, Makoma. Thank you to Joanne and to Steve for the presentations. Joanne asked what we felt was left out. I think from our perspective, Joanne, the whole question of social ownership of some of these assets is important. So if we could please have more work or at least more information being shared around what the commission is thinking around social ownership. I know that you had said that it's one of the things that you are considering. And I think a bigger focus on energy poverty. I know we've spoken about free basic electricity, but I think more work being done around a discussion around what that means and in what ways can people mitigate that themselves beyond just waiting for a top-down approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Lebohang. I will now request Jeshri to make a comment or pose a question to the presenters.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very well, Jeshri.
So there were one or two
audible.
things I wanted to ask, but I promise I will be brief. So the first thing was just in terms of, is working in this bilateral framework to our advantage? Or does it create a race to the bottom where developing countries each offer the best terms to much, much larger developed countries that are loaning, but doing it on terms that are not actually the best for developing countries? And should we be looking in the future towards more multilateral frameworks? The second question was about protecting workers in the coal value chain and just asking how widely are we classifying that? Because, you know, there's a lot of people who like informal contracts and that sort of thing who are very, very much dependent on the coal value chain, but might not be counted depending on how that's done. Then I wanted to ask about, in terms of job creation, is there a wider thought about how this needs to be integrated with industrial policy? Because generally when one's creating new, successful, internationally competitive industries, just throwing a bit of funding at it is not enough without much more industrial policy. And then the final question was, when we're talking about what makes a social ownership model viable, what do we mean by that word viable? Does it mean cost competitive with a subsidized renewables private sector, which is not going to be easy to achieve and is not necessarily the mark that we should be looking at? Thanks. Sorry, I know that was a couple.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeshri. And then I will go to Nkosinathi. Please be brief so that we give other people a chance. I see I've got a lot of people that have raised hands. Nkosinathi, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Mama Koma. Hi, everyone. My question will go straight to Joanne on the time frame of the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan, because now it states that is from 2023 to 2027. But can we maybe do we have the date on? Can we at least have the exact date as to which month on 2023 does this plan start to operate or welcome investment? Or and then on 2007, which date does the first phase of this plan gonna end? And then another thing, on the presentation, one of the slides showed the enabling policies in this just energy transition. But days ago, I had that there is something called a green paper and white paper on electrical vehicle, which the government also has not yet signed. So, and then another enabling policy, which the ministerial determination on energy and the IEP are not, the ministerial determination is outdated. And then the energy, the IEP it's not yet implemented. So I want to know, do you as the PCC have recommendations around those policies which are not yet in place, but we do have them as a country in a form of draft or whatsoever? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nkosinati. Clement, also please try to be brief. Clement, I had noted you after Nkosinati. Lindy Zwana, be ready. Clement? Okay, can we go to Lindy? Are you ready, Lindy, to join?
Yes.
Thank you.
Mina i-concern yami njengo-community member masikhuluma nge-green hydrogen, masikhuluma ngayo most of the times sikhuluma ukuthi we are going to build it, and then masiceda-ke i-energy yakhona sizoyi-exporta, and again la eMzansi sikhuluma ngokuthi we have, i-energy, sinenkinga ye-energy security. So if we're going to plant something and then we take that energy and then say exporter, what are we benefiting tina njenge-community, and especially infrastructure yakhona when it's going to be izoba nama-impacts kuma-communities athize, especially those abahlala phambi kwamalwandle lawo akhulunywa ngokuthi i-green hydrogen izakwakhiwa khona. And enye futhi into, I think a long-term recommendation makuza indaba ya energy security when you talk about solar powers roll out, and a recommendation would be that since we are talking about sustainability and just transition, first let's consider households to be like babe nama solar panels on their roofs, so that sizonciphisa ukunzinyelwa kwe-Eskom as we speak. First, we can deal with household and then roll out solar panels, especially masikhuluma free basic electricity, lapho sikhuluma indigent. We start with them and then the others follow. And especially like njengoba sikhuluma nge-J investment plan, imali mayi-allocate specifically kwa-municipalities ukuthi bazokhona ukuthi ba-roll out all those solar panels kuma-communities abo, because ama-municipalities yibo abasebenza locally nama-households nama-communities on the ground. Ngiyabonga.
Siyabonga, Sis Lindy. Simpiwe, I think most of the participants may have heard, but I would request you to maybe just do a summary in English of what Lindy had said. Simpiwe?
Hi, Makoma, I'm here. So just before I provide the summary, I would like to request that Lindy repeat the first question on green hydrogen. That I didn't hear that carefully, but before she does that, the second question was on the solar panel rollout, and she wanted to know about what support is being provided to households with regards to the rollout of solar panels, especially those indigent households, and are municipalities being capacitated with regards to helping deal with the solar panel rollout.
Okay, thank you very much. And I want to take the three other hands that were up and then request the presenters, not just Joanne. I think some of the question also relates to Steve Nichols' presentation to respond on that. I'm going to call Katrina, who had her hand up, Tando Lukuko after her, and Dombizodwa. Then we go back to the presenters. Thank you.
Thank you. So I have two questions. The first is, to what extent is the private sector carrying any of the risk here? So the impression I'm getting, and please do clarify, is that we keep saying that Eskom and the state don't have any money for anything because there is so much in debt, which we need to repay. Therefore, the private sector has to do everything. And yet it seems that the government is still taking on loans, such as through the IPG, which the private sector will profit from through an unbundled and privatized electricity sector, but one that is ultimately guaranteed by the state. Seems like another classic example of private profit and public risk. The second point, I just want to echo some of the points made about green hydrogen and the concerns that it's a misprioritization of public funds within the just transition. I want to ask the question related to the principles from the framework which were consulted on. What forms of justice is the green hydrogen sector supposed to be delivering? Is it procedural, distributive, restorative? Because these are the principles that are supposed to be guiding the just transition process, according to my understanding. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katrina. Tando Lukuko. Tando.
Hi, Malcolm. Hi, sorry, network issues. Thank you. So I just had a couple questions. One of them has already been asked, but I'll just dovetail on it, which is, are we able to get hard timelines on when the start will be for implementation, including where we're planning to start and who will be involved in that process? And then the second question is around, Joanne, specifically, you were going to mention something on the institutions. Sorry, just put on my video. Joanne, you were going to say something on the institutions, but I don't think we got around to it. So if I could just ask specifically on the transformation aspects of the work that we're about to undertake, is there an institution that's going to be involved there? I know DPME once upon a time used to do the development index, I think, for SA. I haven't seen one lately. Will they be involved in that process? And then the last one also relates on the rooftop solar, particularly for so-called indigents. We touched on this issue of free basic alternative, but surely that alternative could also provide us with the means to expand on rooftop solar, particularly for indigent households, as we say. Of course, all the work that we've seen to date on rooftop solar arguably advantages wealthier households than it does the poorer households. So surely, I guess this is just a question to the room. FBE might provide the necessary mechanism for us to be able to use that to expand rooftop solar onto those households. Thanks, Baba.
Thank you very much, Tando. Before we call on Bizeta, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing the name correctly. Noshin, who is asking about the Mpumalanga. Can you also ask a question? I hope you're still on the call. Nashin, you were asking about whether the JP has been presented to the Mpumalanga provincial government. I just hope that maybe Commissioner Yawich and also Steve Nichols have noted the question, and also members of the Secretariat, so that you can respond to that. I thought I should bring the person in to ask the question. Whilst maybe the person is still preparing, I'll ask Ntombizodwa. Oh,
hello,
thank
can you hear me?
Go ahead. Sorry. Yes,
hello,
I hope I pronounced it correct.
Yes, you did. My name is Naushin Lahibukas. I am a Senior Human Development Officer at the African Development Bank. We are working in close collaboration with the government of South Africa and other IPG partners in the implementation of the JET IP. As you know, I was just wondering, I want to thank Joanne for this excellent presentation of the investment framework. And I wanted to know, since we are going to be decommissioning these 3 power plants in the Mpumalanga province at the provincial level, has any of these presentation been made to the provincial government? And if they have, what type of comments or reactions have you received so far? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then can we go to Ntombizodwa?
Okay, hi everyone. I'll just get straight to the point. Some of the point LinkedIn Zwana has covered me, but now I want, hello, can you hear me?
We can hear you very well, Sister Zota.
Oh, okay, all right. So now my question will go to Steve. Ne? Steve said something that maybe load shedding will take something like 18 months or above that. So already we've got challenges, see that people are losing jobs because of this load shedding, and then other companies are closing down, and then other companies, if they keep people to work, it's either 4 days in or 3 days in and then 3 days off, or others they work 4 hours a day and then exchanging one another. So my question would be, how best can that be help those companies by subsidizing them? And I don't know how, or maybe by erecting solar panels to their companies so that their businesses must not shut down. I really don't know, but I want to know how best can they do that. And then the other question will be, Joanne, they are in the presentation, they are talking about this green hydrogen. I would like to ask in reality that PCC or the government to really organize somebody who really understand and knows and did work about this green hydrogen, because we are talking, even if it's they are making it as if it's green, yes, I understand, but how green is it? Because we know when we talk about gas, it's dangerous, no matter what kind of gas it is, except the gas that it's made from renewable energy, like a biogas digester, where we do the gas with scrap food. So how best is it green? Can they organize somebody to really do the workshop for us? Although we are having organizations that are helping our organization at the grassroots level to understand this green hydrogen. So I would like from their side to try and organize for us to have a workshop, because we are talking about mitigation, we're talking about adaptation. And my worry being that this is going to include the infrastructure that must take part in transporting this gas, maybe to export it to other countries. So how green is it, this green hydrogen? Thank you.
Sebonga, thanks very much, Asizodwa. I'm now going to hand over to the presenters and the Secretariat to also make some inputs, but I've noted a number of people else also from the chat, but after the responses or the discussion with the presenters, I'm going to request the following people that have raised their hands and also had that have written on the Q&A box. Richard Worthington, Richard Hesley, Kungega Njobe, Peter Volpe, Courtney Morgan, and Andile Zulu. So I'll be calling you in no particular order after we have had a discussion and responses from the presenters. Thank you very much. I'm handing over to you, Joanne and Steve Nichols. Thank you.
Thank you, Akoma. I'm not going to answer each question individually. I think that there are clusters of issues, and let me try and take them in groups. I think some of them do need to be answered by the PCC and by Steve and possibly Deepak, particularly around some of the issues around process. Okay, I hear that there is a significant concern from this constituency around green hydrogen, and I also hear the request for, I suppose, an information session on green hydrogen, and maybe the PCC can respond to that. I think it would be extremely useful. And I think that hearing the questions, I think there is a sense that potential finance for green hydrogen is finance that is taken away from the poor and from putting in place initiatives that might support the poor. And I don't believe that that is correct. And I think that at the beginning, what we did was to look at the sources of this finance. And essentially there is public finance from climate finance institutions, from MTBs, from DFIs, concessional finance. And then there is some level of grant finance, inadequate, and we need to work harder on that. And then there's also private sector contribution to this package. And my understanding is that the investment that would go into a green hydrogen economy would fundamentally be investment that is earmarked for private sector purposes. So I think just to clarify that this is not, you know, it's not saying there's a pot of money and are we going to give it to the poor or are we going to give it into green hydrogen? I don't think that that is the way that this is going to work. Having said that, I think that our country is in a very risky situation in relation to the way that we see ourselves fitting into a kind of a rapidly transforming world economy. And it's risky. We are behind in digitalization. We are behind in energy. We are behind in productivity. We are a small open economy. We have the hugely high levels of unemployment, inequality, and poverty. And I think that this finance and the work that underpins it, the country's policy framework and the work that institutions like the PCC are doing, enable us to be able to say, how are we going to put in place the investments that are going to put South Africa into the 21st century, that are going to enable us to continue with economic activities that allow us to build our economy, but to do it in a way that is low carbon and that supports the aims of decarbonization globally. And I think that green hydrogen is seen the world over as a solution to that. I think the opportunity for us is that it allows us to create a new sector of the economy with new jobs, new infrastructure, new opportunities for many people, new skills in parts of the country where there is very little in particular happening at this point in time. I do take the point that it needs to be implemented in a way that means that there isn't a competition between finance for the electricity sector and finance for the green hydrogen sector, but I'm quite certain that the phasing can be managed. So I really think we do need further information on this. I think that there are particular competitive advantages that South Africa has in relation to green hydrogen, including our existing intellectual property as a country, our space, our sunshine, and a whole set of potential opportunities. And I don't think that that this is an either-or situation. Then on all of the issues around free energy poverty, free basic electricity, because it's free basic electricity, not energy, and the issues around social ownership. I think the points are well taken. There is further work that needs to be done. There is an opportunity here as a country that I believe that we can either take advantage of and use the finance attached to this program and the finance that can be mobilized around this program to really make very significant improvements to the quality of life and the economic possibilities of our people, or in structuring programs for investment. And I think that part of the work going forward is really to build those programs. So a lot of work to be done with municipalities. Some of the municipalities are already looking at issues of rolling out green energy. I'm not certain that any of them are looking at the opportunity sufficiently at the opportunity to do that in a way that addresses energy poverty and that allows the issues of the cost of electricity and the cost of power for the poor to be alleviated. So I think it's an opportunity space. And I'm certainly hoping that it's one of the things that in the consultation with local government, that we can start to look at how we can work collectively with local government in order to be able to build these programs and do the work that is necessary to arrive at systems that really do address energy poverty, and that can start to really build a social ownership sector in our country. So essentially agreeing with the points that have been raised about this as important. Then I think that on bilateral, the point that was made around protecting workers in the coal value chain, again, this needs to be programmed and plans need to be put in place. One of the things that I think that is really important is that there's a lot of figures that are thrown around about the numbers of workers in the coal value chain, how long they're going to be there, how long the coal value chain is going to be a major part of the economy, or is it going to decline? And at the PCC meeting on last Friday, Professor Harun Borat from the University of Cape Town said that they are doing an in-depth study of the coal value chain. And I think that that is going to be a really important piece of work to be able to provide us with an information base that is going to allow the kinds of questions that you are asking to be able to be programmed and put into programs that really can benefit the people. And we need more granular information and data. So I take the point that the coal value chain needs to have a broad definition. And for me, it certainly would include, the people in the informal sector who are providing food to the workers on the coal mines or in power stations. And we need to understand the fact that their livelihoods related to the coal value chain. If the coal value chain is no longer there, how are they going to be supported? Which is, I think, the underlying point that was being made. In terms of the issue of timeframes and process, and I take the point about broader industrial policy. I think that in particular, and as I said in the presentation, the work on NEVs needs more to be done. And I think that it really is because the issues around industrial policy and the policy framework there needs to be pinned down, and agreements between government and the industry are going to be critical in doing that. And we aren't there at this point in time yet. So I take the point. On the question around timeframes, in a sense, this program is already starting to happen. There's a lot of work to be done in terms of both the programming and the finalization of the deployment of a whole lot of this $8.5 billion finance. Where we are also at the moment is that there are a number of both additional countries as well as potential financiers who are coming and asking South Africa how they can come into this process and how they can support the investment plan, and that work now needs to be taken forward. I spoke about the work that is being done with the IPG partners around kind of basically the analysis of the grant component of this program so that we can start to look at what the space is to be able to take some of these other initiatives that we're talking about and use particularly technical assistance and project preparation funds to be able to start to program that. So the program is ongoing. There is no set month of start or finish. It's a broad 5-year process. I am hoping that once this process is concluded and the input from it has been incorporated, that we can get this implementation process moving very, very rapidly. I take the points that have been put on the chat around governance. I think we are all extremely concerned that there are tight and strong enough governance modalities put in place and sufficient transparency and a sufficiently robust M&E framework to ensure that this money is used as it is meant to be used. And just let me look, I'm sure I've missed out something important. So just let me look at my notes. Yeah.
You shared the Mpumalanga provincial government.
Oh, okay, so and maybe the PCC can respond to this. I don't know if any of you heard the Mpumalanga Premier's input at the State of the Nation address, her response to the State of a Nation address, which was a very strong statement around commitment to move the just energy transition in Mpumalanga forward. And I think that part of that is based on the work that has been done, both by a wide range of organizations in Mpumalanga over the last few years, by Eskom, as well as the content of this investment plan. Having said that, and I'm going to come to the governance issue that Richard raised right at the end and address Mpumalanga in that. I think that there needs to be, as the institutions and structures are set up in Mpumalanga around coordination, there needs to be a much more in-depth engagement. In the process of writing the investment plan, there was some level of consultation, I'm not so sure adequately, including with some of the key municipalities in Mpumalanga around some of the proposals that are in the investment plan. Just on governance, and I did put up the slide with the governance approach. The way that the implementation will be governed, or the implementation structure will be governed, is that it will continue to report into cabinet through an interministerial committee. There is then an intergovernmental steering committee, or slightly broader than an intergovernmental steering committee, that is intended to be established, that will bring together the key departments, and I think there were questions around that, as well as institutions like the PCC, the DBSA, the IDC, Eskom, and the Mpumalanga provincial government, that will ensure that these programs are taken forward. And I mean, clearly, as the process moves, you may well need other participants, for example, someone who can represent municipalities more broadly. So that will then provide oversight and direction to the small implementation unit that will work together with the IPG partners and in a partnership approach across society. The JET IP project management unit's prime role, as I said earlier, is to ensure that the finance that is available is appropriately deployed to the agreed upon programs, and that work is done to both mobilize the additional finance that is needed, as well as to ensure that that support is given to the process of developing the programs and the projects that would enable that finance to really support the energy transition in the country. Sis Makome, if I can just one thing, I see that there are Neil Cole and Janice Johnston, who've done a lot of the finance work in relation to this program, are both on the line. And before I finished, I wanted to ask if either of them wanted to add anything or pick up on any of the points that have been made. Thanks.
Okay, yes, thanks, Johan. I had noted that Neil and Janine are on the call, and I was going to request either of them and Deepak to maybe complement some of the responses that you have. If they would want to, maybe please go ahead, Deepak, Janine, and Neil.
Thank you very much, Makoma. I think Joanne has quite adequately answered most of the questions. At a high level, because there have been questions with respect to the allocation, in particular to hydrogen, relative to electricity and new energy vehicles, I just wanted to clarify that within the 8.5 billion, hydrogen does not have a significant amount allocated to it. However, as we take a view to 2030 and the potential, and we stress this even from the PCC's point of view, the potential for the country to in fact become successful and global players potentially in the hydrogen supply and value chains, we need to keep an eye on developing our innate capabilities as a country in hydrogen. So I just wanted to clarify that part of the 8.5 is not a massive allocation to hydrogen. The 8.5 billion in large part is allocated to electricity, which I think all of us on the call, regardless of the sector that we come from, will probably agree is the first stage move that we have to make to position ourselves to achieve both our economic development, just transition objectives, as well as decarbonization. There was a question with respect to the multilateral system and why we're focusing on bilateral agreements. I think it's important to say that we are firmly part of the multilateral system through the UNFCCC and therefore through the COP processes. However, each country, even within the developing world, has its own unique, peculiar economic, social, and political structures. And in this context, I think South Africa is not necessarily proceeding way ahead of the other countries, but other countries have also, based on the JET IP experience of South Africa, now preparing similar statements of intention with respect to energy transitions, given their own conditions. And the PCC, together with associated institutions, are in fact in dialogue with these developing country partners, cousins, brothers, sisters, to ensure that we do not bifurcate from a sense of unity with the rest of the developing world. I just want to say that with respect to finance, governance, and institutional arrangements, we concur that given the history that we've been through in this country, any resources that are intended, whether it's public or private, to be deployed in the direction of our transition must be properly governed. Institutional arrangements must be put in place to ensure that the monies intended and mobilized and then scaled up do in fact flow to intended purposes given the plans that we have. So I just wanted to make those few overarching comments. Thank you very much, Makoma.
Thank you very much, Deepak. And Neil, would you want to also complement or respond to some of the questions raised, or are you comfortable that Joanne had responded adequately to all of them?
Thank you very much, Makoma. So yeah, so I think Janice and Joanne and Deepak covered most of the questions very comprehensively. Maybe just the question on the free basic electricity, which I suppose ties to the question on energy poverty, and to bring that to the JET IP. So the section on the municipal section in the JET IP and the costing of that did not include how the free basic electricity grant was going to change, or what the cost would be going forward. I mean, we mainly focused on what would be needed in terms of an investment to municipalities that would prepare municipalities for the transition, taking into account that our municipalities, especially our metros, are not equal in terms of the revenue raising capacity, et cetera. The way that we view it is that the free basic electricity grant, I mean, it's a policy decision, and it is a policy decision that needs to be taken by government in terms of the intergovernmental fiscal framework and how funds are allocated for grants and also for the equitable share. And our municipalities then take decisions in terms of increasing their grant for free basic electricity support to households. But this is certainly a policy area that would need to be explored further by National Treasury, COCA, and also DMRE. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Neil. Maybe Neil, before I go to the next person, would you please introduce yourself formally? I realize that
I apologize. I'm going to keep my camera off though, because that may make me lose the signal. So I'm Neil Cole. I was with the JETP Secretariat from June last year, and I am now part of the JET IP project management unit, along with Joanne, my colleague Janice that's on the line, and a few others that will be taking responsibility for setting up the implementation framework for the investment plan. And if you ask me what I like most about this work, it is when we were in Lephalale consulting with the community.
You can share. Okay.
Thank you.
Welcome, and hoping that you join us next time we do a community consultation. Jenny or Steve, or would you rather make those comments at the end? Are you, Janine?
I'm happy to. I just wanted to possibly just add one sort of element in terms of the financing that we've discussed and some of the questions. So I'm Janice Johnston. I'm part of Joanne and Neil's team within the JET IP PMU that's been mentioned. And I just wanted to sort of highlight the full appreciation of ensuring that the right financing goes to the right projects. And that's very much built into the financing principles that we've articulated within the plan. And that we're also looking to expand a more equitable risk sharing model within the various funding programs that we put together, such that there is a more balanced view between public and private. And that is very much embedded within the plan. So I'll just make that because I know that was touching on some of the questions around private sector effectively being de-risked totally via the public sector, and that's sort of not how we're effectively viewing it, but we are trying to ensure that the funding we get is catalytic such that it will enable us to crowd in as much additional financing as possible.
Thank you, Janice. Steve, I would like to request that maybe you keep your comments when we up until the end of the session, so that I can take the other hands that have been up for quite a long time. I said in no particular order, I have noted Richard Wellington, that I think some of your part of your question was responded to. I've noted Kungela Njobe, Richard Hesley, Julia Taylor, Peter Volpe, Andile Zulu, and Courtney Morgan. So, and then additional, I have Commissioner Commissioner Louis Naidu also having raised her hand. So I have recognized all these hands. If possible, I'll also check the chat and see if I can also invite people on the to do so. I may have, I think at some stage there was a hand from Clement, and he had problems with the audio or connecting. So if Clement is still online and still wants to make a point, if that has not been responded to, but I think from the chat what I've read, some of his points have been responded to. So I will now pose their question or make their comments. Andile Zulu. If not, I will pass to Richard Hesley.
Great, thanks very much for the presentations. I'm Richard from International Institute for Sustainable Development. My question is just basically one of clarity, possibly for Deepak. Of the 8.5 billion, the focus, the majority is around electricity sector, and within that there's transmission and distribution grid listed. This also links back to Steve's presentation earlier about, the need to deal with the grid. My question is, when a lot of people think of the grid, they think of the pylons, the wires, and the substations, but other technology like batteries, synchronous condensers, the grid-forming inverters, all offer flexibility and resilience to the grid and provide a bunch of grid-related services. So my question is simply whether the investment plan could be used for those technologies like your batteries, the synchronous condensers and the inverters that assist with the grid, even though they might not typically be classified as part of the grid.
Okay, thank you very much, Richard Halsley. I'll go now to Courtney Morgan.
Thank you, Comrade Makoma, and thank you for the presentations, everybody. I hope I'm audible. Thank you. I was just wondering how, the issue around Eskom's corruption and the director interview might affect perceptions internationally and might affect the investment. But also related to that, I take the point from Joanne about institutions and interministerial committees who will be involved in monitoring. And I just wanted to ask, is there a role or space for civil society to play that kind of role? Or be involved in monitoring as well throughout the implementation processes, and not just, before the money is here, but really once the finances are flowing into the country, what is the role of civil society in monitoring as well?
Okay, thank you very much, Courtney, for that question or that clarity. Richard Worthington, are you still on the line? And would you still want to maybe ask a question or comment?
No, I'm covered. Thanks, Makoma.
Thank you very much. And then we'd go to Julia Taylor.
Thanks very much, Makoma.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm a researcher at the Southern Centre for Inequality Studies at WITS. And I wanted to ask, I wanted to find out how the JET IP Secretariat was set up, how elected, and what process was followed. And then also how the JET IP Secretariat relates to the PCC, and overall, who has decision-making power over something like the JET IP? How do these different bodies relate to each other, and who gets to make the decisions, I guess, is my key question. And then lastly, Janice just touched on the financing principles. I guess a question is, what are those financing principles, and are they, do they account for, energy poverty and access and these other important issues of distributive, procedural, and restorative justice that the Just Transition Framework outlines? Thanks, that's all from me.
Thank you, Julia. And Peter Volpe. Are you still on the line?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Makoma. I think some of my questions have been answered. I just want to say also thank you. I think, there's some really comprehensive work going on, and in a way, we're all going to say we need more money and more money should go here and there. So I would hope that the JET IP will be organic in the sense, as Joanne said, the regulatory policy space is changing quite rapidly, and that there would be space to review and see where money might need to be better invested, I guess. I hear the response around the governance, and I can't think of the name of the previous speaker, Courtney, I think, raised the director and sort of a bit like the elephant in the room about governance. So we really need to be mindful, and I guess hoping that it won't impact on the international position or that our response is such that it secures the investment. But my last point is really around the energy poverty, that it's kind of seen separately around the triple challenges of poverty, inequality, and unemployment. Actually, it needs to be embedded and all of that mainstreamed into how we're addressing the just energy transition and the justice element, and how we do that and address the whole free basic electricity and all the issues that people have spoken about. But yeah, thank you for this space and for the work that's done.
Thank you very much, Peter. Jaco, sorry, I'm unable to pronounce your last name.
Thank you, Makoma, and thank you, everyone. I just have a question around the scope of the consultation here. There are some very fundamental issues that have been raised in this consultation and in previous ones, and I just wanted to know, my impression is that there's only really the inputs from these consultations are being taken up only in terms of the details of the JET IP and in terms of the implementation plan. But yeah, so I just wanted to know really what is the scope for commenting on more of the fundamentals of the plan, like that's been raised here. And then just a quick second question, similar to Julia Taylor's question, is just again, requesting a bit more clarity in terms of who will be taking up the work of revising the details of the JET IP, and will the work of this group or secretariat be made public? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jaco. And the last hand I recognized was that of Pungek and Jobe.
Chair, sorry. Chair, can you hear me?
You audible. Thank you.
Okay, I had since put my hand down, but I'll quickly say a few comments on behalf of our organization. I had since put my hand up because quite a lot of what I wanted to say, which we'll elaborate on when we make our submission on the 27th, had been said. But maybe quickly to emphasize that the point around the principle of equitable risk sharing between private sector and public, we would like to see that reflected a lot more clearer in the actual allocation itself. It's not also clear in the in how the allocation of funding, how that is distributed between where private sector would come in and where this public money would come in. So that would be one thing we'd want to look at. And then the second issue would be around, perhaps we'll make those comments more detailed around green hydrogen. We take note of the responses, but we'll make further comments in due course. Otherwise, we would just wanted to commend the work that's been done. I do think that this puts us in a very good position to make very, very structured comments and to improve this plan. Hopefully, the implementation can be effective as well. So we would like to also echo the issues of making sure governance is strengthened when we come to implementation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for emphasizing some of the points that have been raised. I'm now going to, and I just hope that after who will give us a summary and close off the meeting. May I invite Steve Nichols and Johan Yawich and those that are supporting them to maybe respond to some of the clarity-seeking questions, the comments, and the questions that have been posed. Thank you. May we start with Steve? I think there are some of the points that may be related to your presentation, and I didn't give you a chance to respond adequately before. And then we come to your one, which I think most of the clarity taking and the questions were directed to you.
Sorry, Makoma, I see Louise also wanted to say something.
Oh, I'm sorry about that, Louise. May I allow you to make your intervention? I'm sorry about it, sorry. I
Thank
didn't
you,
know
Chairperson. So when the task team was originally set up, informally in chatting to Mr. Minele, I had suggested that the Secretariat or the task team consider actually inviting civil society participation onto that committee. And I would reiterate that recommendation here for the implementation group. I think the consultations we're having today will remain very important, because then you have inclusive and wide participation. But, you know, you might as well be getting these views right then and there in the discussion of the rollout. So I would urge that, you know, people consider that either on the basis of, you know, particular expertise on finance, such as WWF and others have, but also just in terms of perspective. And, you know, there are civil society formations who could elect a representative to serve in such a role. You know, there's SA CAN and there's the Climate Justice Coalition and others, but I mean, those are the two that spring immediately to mind as having quite a wide umbrella in civil society. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Louise. And let's get back. Steve, I'll start with you, then we go to Johan. And thank you for that point, Louise.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks everybody for your comments. This has been a really rich conversation. And I kind of wanted to maybe highlight some process points. We don't expect to be able to deal with every point raised in this particular process that we're running, but want to point to a much more long-term sort of relationship between the PCC and social partners. And so we will be able to deal with all of these things over time. And so I would say we're currently in a sort of identifying of key issues phase. And even in the electricity recommendations report, I mean, a couple of people have referred to these documents needing to be living, needing to be updated. This is something that we would certainly do and certainly agree with. And so just to emphasize that this conversation needs to be contextualized in a whole series of conversations around a whole range of transition issues. So for example, the PCC is also working on a just transition framework implementation plan. And we're also working on pilots on economic diversification in Mpumalanga, and many of the issues that have been raised will also be included and thought about in those processes. In terms of the JET IP, you know, my personal concern is that it's easy to be distracted by the 8.5 billion and forget the 80 odd billion that's needed to complete the investment plan. And I think we should be thinking carefully about that. Where do these other sources of money come from? Where does the risk sit? So a lot of people spoke about this idea of public and private sector risk sharing, so that we don't kind of socialize risk and privatize gain. I think that is an important part of the conversation. And certainly, you know, when we talk about government balance sheets not being able to support funding of some of these heavy infrastructure projects, they're also not able to support huge risk sharing arrangements, and so, or just being the predominant risk taker. So certainly in how we think about energy and electricity system models, we're going to have to think very carefully about private sector risk taking. And part of the key key there is how we do market reforms in the electricity sector to enable that kind of risk taking from the private sector. But certainly the days of government underwritten private sector investment in renewable energy are declining. On this question of hydrogen, one of the key challenges that we have in thinking about systems and investment is timelines. And so certainly hydrogen won't play a huge role in immediate investment and in immediate trade. But in the long term, there's some big issues that hydrogen can potentially resolve. And so in particular, I guess it's debatable about whether hydrogen will play a major role in electricity generation, but certainly it's something that is an option that we should be exploring. But green hydrogen in particular is very important in making our industry competitive, particularly those industries that are exposed to CBAM, the European Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, particularly iron and steel and things like cement. And so what is the sort of last step in emissions that we don't know how to sequester or how to get out of the system other than through a fuel switching to something like hydrogen, and hydrogen is very important. In addition to that, we have a balance of trade challenge. So many of the things that we export that we use to earn foreign currency and help support debt are at risk in the global shifts in terms of consumption. And so we need other things that can help prop up the economy. And so using hydrogen to protect some of the export market goods that we produce is important, as well as potentially providing an export market in itself, which would then help solve some of the balance of payments issues. Now, there's no guarantee that these things will work, but we need to be investing now in pilots that will test whether we will be competitive or not. And a couple of the speakers have already mentioned that, at least in the case of hydrogen, we have the right kinds of renewable energy conditions, the right sort of skill sets, the right availability of land. And so while this is not a 100% guaranteed thing that will work, it's certainly something that we should be exploring, and it's certainly something that the rest of the world is interested in exploring. Just some high-level views on the hydrogen questions. And then on the question that was directed directly to me around load shedding, again, we don't have all the answers on how we will support small businesses in the transition, where load shedding is a part of that transition. And so we're still researching that, and we're still thinking about that. We're still very open to your suggestions. We know that this is a social partner that thinks deeply about these issues. So we would love to hear any research that you've done and any thinking that you have on those issues. The last question is just a very technical question. Someone asked about, what is green hydrogen? And so it's a very confusing space, but of course, there are many ways of generating hydrogen as a fuel, from gray, which uses gas as an input, to green, which uses renewable energy as an input. So really the different colors of hydrogen refer to the process with which they're made. And there's even a pink hydrogen, but green hydrogen really is hydrogen manufactured using renewable energy as the input to the process, and therefore it's considered to be carbon neutral and therefore given the tag green. Of course, any of these technologies require careful thought around the just transition and how they're implemented, and that comes back to questions around ownership models. Just some high-level perspectives from my side. I will hand over to some of my colleagues for further questions.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you very much. And Johan?
Thank you, Makoma. And I really kind of think that the PCC should maybe respond on the issues that have been raised around the process, around this consultative, set of engagements and where it goes, because really it is the PCC that kind of will be responsible for compiling the report that will go to the interministerial committee and the presidency, and for dealing with that. I think that Richard's point around how the transmission finance or funds that are set aside for transmission can be used is taken. Richard, kind of in the process of doing the investment plan, we identified that a significant proportion of finance allocated to the electrical sector should go into transmission for all of the reasons that we discussed in Steve's input earlier. And I don't see at this point in time, there are kind of no one has put any restrictions on how that should be invested. So I presume that would be the technologies and the what you're suggesting could in all likelihood, and I think could and should be included as part of those investments. Can I deal with this corruption issue? I kind of tried to do it in earlier on, but maybe it needs a more specific issue. So I think that there is a commitment, and just to answer one of the other questions, there was a slide that was put out on financing principles that does stress the need for good and transparent governance of this process. And I think that certainly as it moves forward, it is something that we are absolutely committed to. And I think the PCC as an institution with a mandate around monitoring and evaluation of climate action in the country has also got a role to play. So where we are at the moment is that there are, out of this, firstly, there is an $8.5 billion commitment that has been made by the IPG. Of that commitment, there are 2 policy loans that have been negotiated with National Treasury, and where National Treasury and the Fiscus is the recipient of the loans. Those are the only loans that have been, at this point in time, pinned down. The rest of the loan finance is still to be negotiated, either between National Treasury, with National Treasury in cases where it goes to the sovereign, or with whoever the recipient is, as well as then obviously with National Treasury if there is a sovereign guarantee implication going forward. So that process is still to happen. That money hasn't flowed. And I think that that is important to understand in terms of the kind of conversation that is happening in the public around the potential for corruption. So there's still quite a long way to go for that finance to be deployed. There is then a grant element to that finance where we are waiting for the IPG partners in relation to the 8.5 billion to set out if that money has been deployed, where is it, who's the recipient, how is it being managed, where is it sitting? And so that information is being collated, and we will then look at it and kind of have a better overview of what the nature of that finance is, and we'll be able to also engage where that finance is unallocated, that grant finance, to talk about what priorities are. And I think that this process becomes a really critical process in terms of guiding the conversation and the discussion with the IPG partners around unallocated grant finance. There is then, I think, the reality that in addition to this kind of overall macro process of looking at where that finance should go, each individual financier or donor would obviously sign agreements, contractual agreements with the receiving party around the terms and conditions of either grants or loans, and would then monitor the use of that finance in relation to it. So I think that that is really an important part of the governance and the safeguards, is that those kinds of contractual arrangements. I think there's then a question about building a monitoring and evaluation framework for this program overall. And that is work that the project management unit is starting to do, and will do in collaboration with two sets of parties, firstly with the IPG partners, but secondly with the institutions within the country that are already doing work around M&E frameworks for climate change, including the PCC and including institutions like the DPME who've done considerable work. So we will try and ensure that there is a transparent enough M&E framework that talks to this program specifically, that is developed, and work on that is will get underway shortly. And there's already been a bit of conversation with the IPG about some of how that can happen. Then in terms of the governance arrangements, ultimately it is the interministerial committee that oversees this program, reports into cabinet. So ultimately it is cabinet that takes the ultimate decisions in relation to how this program proceeds, and how this finance is mobilized and deployed. And then in order to support that process, as I said earlier, there is a steering committee that will be assembled. I take note of the comments that are being made around participation. I think that is something that in the PCC recommendations could and should be addressed. And then there is a kind of technical capacity that has been assembled to basically do the work on the instruction from the IMC and the steering committee, and to basically be the legs that put the work together. So I hope that clarifies the governance operations. The secretariat that did the work of the IP, to answer Julia specifically, last year was a structure that was jointly agreed by the International Partners Group and by the South African government. It was in part assembled through support from the climate investment funds, who made a bit of finance available to the IPG, and it also then had a number of South Africans who were additional South Africans, I should say, who were brought in to work on that process. And it was a structure that reported into both the IPG and into the Presidential Climate Finance Task Team. The PCFGT reported into the Interministerial Committee. So I hope that gives a bit more clarity on the governance issues. I note Peter's comments. I think the PCC needs to answer Yako's question. We take Kungeka's point around the principles of equitable risk sharing, and it would be very useful to have some input from the WWF if you have very clear ideas on how that could be achieved. Yeah, I think those are the questions that I want to answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joanne, for that comprehensive response on some of the comments and the questions. I will invite now the PCC Secretariat. I'm not sure whether Deepak or Stephen would want to take to respond to the question around process or around this consultative round of engagements. Deepak, thank you.
Thank you, Makoma. Just very briefly, and then there were questions with respect to Eskom, Andre de Ruyter, etc., which I'm hoping Crispian, our executive director, might come in to answer some of the questions. With respect to process, I think very early on, we realized that we couldn't just have one-off sessions with stakeholder groups, and therefore we split it into two, this being the first of the two that we will hold with civil society and the NGO sector. And the next one will actually be a more thorough consultation, where we're hoping that out of this information sharing session, the next session can actually be much more forthcoming on the part of the constituency with respect to what the recommendations are, whether that's written or verbal. What we will do is collate through all of the sessions per stakeholder the sets of issues that have been raised, and then aggregate those without losing the flavor of each stakeholder grouping's comments into a report which we intend to submit to the President as mandated. And that will be a true reflection of the outcome of our engagement in consultation with stakeholder groups and communities. And then, as I said earlier as well, taking cognizance of that, as well as the work that we ourselves are doing in Steve and your working group with respect to mitigation pathways, we will then reconcile those with the JET IP and develop a PCC set of recommendations from our perspective as a PCC also to the President. So we will be sure to be true to the outcome of these consultations as we report back to the President on what the various stakeholders have said in these engagements, and then in the PCC from our perspective, both with respect to the Just Transition Framework, also with reference to the energy pathways that are being enunciated, some of the issues related to adaptation, particularly climate resiliency and just transition projects in the environment in which the JET IP will be implemented. We will then make recommendations. I certainly take note of the one, I guess, recommendation of how do we ensure some level of representativity of either just civil society or civil society and other stakeholders in the project management unit. We certainly will consider that and look at whether that should be a specific recommendation in the PCC recommendation on the JET IP. On governance, I don't want to say beyond just overstressing that we are very, very clear that there needs to be a linkage between funds that flow and outcomes that are achieved. Janice has covered how in the JET IP there is a view that projects themselves will be recipients. Of course, the question is, what are the institutional arrangements, particularly around projects that flow through different spheres of government, here being predominantly the municipal level. And in this respect, the PCC has already embarked on a piece of work to look at what the institutional governance issues might be in what we call a just transition financing mechanism. And we're hoping that in the next couple of months, what we will, as the PCC, be able to put on the table is a set of institutional and governance recommendations over and above how to Steve's point, mobilize the balance that is required for our transition, in this case, the JET IP, in the case of the PCC, the overall just transition, and how we scale that up with very, very much due regard for equitable allocation of risks and to ensure, as I said, good governance. So I'm not sure if Crispian does want to come in at this stage and maybe
yes, thank you very much. I was actually going to request him after you speak. Dr. Crispian Olva, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to everyone for the really insightful comments and questions. I've really enjoyed following this discussion. You know, I'm partly covered by Joanne and Deepak, but, you know, with respect to the Andre de Ruyter issues that have been raised, we've been aware for a long time as the public and as the Commission that Eskom was deeply corrupted. I mean, I think the Zondo Commission report goes into this in an enormous amount of detail. And, you know, we've equally been hearing stories from the mining community about the extensive criminalization within the coal value chain. And, you know, what this latest set of allegations and the intelligence report that's come out point to is a continuation of those levels of corruption. I don't think it fundamentally changes our approach to the JET IP or to the energy recommendations. I mean, what I think we're all very clear on is that we need to ring fence these funds very tightly, and we need to put in place proper scrutiny and accountability mechanisms to make sure the resources aren't diverted. So, I think we have been aware of this issue. We're designing this program in a way that, reinforces and bolsters it going forward. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Olver. And I would like to thank everyone for their participation. And this was one of the enriching discussions. And would also like to thank Steve Nichols and Joanne Yowick for the information sharing on the electricity planning and also on the Just Energy Transition Partnership Investment Plan. And I just hope that from this information sharing, though it seemed like from the participants, people were like way affair with the contents of this information that was shared today, or the presentations. And this lays a ground for the submissions that would come or that would be made as indicated, that they would be collated and also included. And with the recommendations that the PCC had shared, I think civil society also have got recommendations. We heard about some of the recommendations that were put across. And I know that Commissioner Melissa would have picked up on some of those, and that would be her summary. I would like to thank you very much for having afforded us this opportunity to have this information sharing with everyone. And as the Commission, I think we're looking forward to having a much more deeper consultation on the 27th of March. I was told that it's around Johannesburg, and see you then. Then I'll give over to Commissioner Melissa Foray to close for us, unless if there's any announcements from the PCC. I know that there's been communication continuously. If not now, I know that people will get that either through email or on the website or on other platforms that the Commission communicates on. Thank you very much, Commissioner Melissa Foray.
Thanks, Makoma. I must say, I don't think there's anything else that I need to say. I think you've done an excellent conclusion to this conversation. So I will leave it at that. I think I should just add one process point, which is that I understand from Steve that the electricity planning recommendations will be contained in a document that will be available at least 1 week before that colloquium on the 29th. So that will also give us an opportunity to have something to comment on ahead of that meeting. But otherwise, thanks for the excellent facilitation. Thank you for the really, really great inputs. And I'm sure we're going to see some fantastic submissions coming out of this sector. I think Deepak said that he wants to hear more from us. You must be careful what you wish for, Deepak. And then I think we can just thank our presenters and everybody who participated. All right, that brings the session to an end.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.